Hey everyone, we've been talking about lists, and in this example video I've got this problem that we're going to write a program that solves. We're going to write a program that calculates the first n values of the Fibonacci sequence. So if you don't know the Fibonacci sequence, it's a really famous sequence that has a lot of applications in like music and art and science. The first two values of the Fibonacci sequence are defined as 1 and 1, and then each subsequent value is calculated by summing the previous two values. It's kind of cool. You can read about it on your own, but for example, so the sequence is initialized to 1 and 1, and then the next number would be the sum of those two numbers, which is 2. And then the next number is the sum of the previous two. 2 and 1 make 3, and then 3 and 2 make 5. 5 and 3 make 8, and so on. So this would be the first n equals 6 numbers. But it could go on forever. It does go on forever, but you have to specify how many numbers you want in this program. And so the program should define a function that accepts integer n as input and returns the ordered sequence in a list. So for example, we're going to return the numbers 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8 in a list. And we're going to use the append method inside a loop to calculate the sequence. Also, we're going to set the default parameter for the function to n equals 1, and we're going to have the main program call the function with n equals 6, then n equals 20, and then with no input. And in each case, the main program should print the sequence. All right, let's get started. I'm going to define my function using the def keyword def, and I need to pick a name for my function, so I'm just going to pick something descriptive like my Fibonacci. So that's very descriptive, right? And then it takes an input capital N, and it should have a default value according to the problem statement of 1. Good. Colon indentation. Now, the sequence, as we're told in the problem, is initialized to 1, 1. Like those are just the first two values. They're not calculated, they're just, that's what they are. And so I'm going to put 1 and 1 in a list, and I'm going to call that list whatever I want, but it should be descriptive. So I'm going to call it sequence. That's very descriptive. Now, with that input capital N coming in, right, if n is equal to 0, we need to return 0 numbers, or like the empty list. And if n is equal to 1, then we don't return the sequence, we return just the first value, which is 1. And if n is equal to 2, we don't require any calculations, we just return the sequence, 1, 1. It's only when n is equal to 3 or 4 or 5 and so on that we need to start calculating the sequence. And so I need to handle all of these cases separately. And I'm going to do that with, there are a few ways of doing this, but I'm going to do that with an if statement. I'm going to say if n is equal to 0. So in this case, I don't want any numbers in the sequence. I'm going to return just the empty list. Right? Our function has to return a list. So I'm returning the empty list. And you know what? We might want to handle like when n is less than 0, like -1, -2, -3, and so on. So I'm just going to put less than or equals to 0 there to handle those cases. Either way, we're going to return the empty list. And we're going to say if n is equal to 1. In this case, I'm going to return the first number in the sequence, which is 1. But because our function is supposed to return a list, I need to put the 1 in the list with the square brackets. I don't want it to return an integer, right? I want it to return a list. Then we're going to say if, oh, I shouldn't have the colon there, if. We're going to say if n is equal to 2. And in this case, I want to return 1, 1 in a list, but I already have that defined as sequence. Sequence is 1, 1. So I could just put, I'm going to return the sequence. Right? Now, all other cases, so this is the else block. I need to start calculating the future, the future numbers in the sequence. Maybe future is a bad word, the subsequent numbers in the sequence. So there are a few ways I could do this. And I'm going to say, I'm going to use a for loop. We're going to say for I in range, and I want to know how many times am I going to loop here, and I don't really need to loop let's say n is equal to 6, I don't need to loop 6 times because I have the first two numbers already defined. So I just need to loop n minus 2 times. So I'm going to give the range function n minus 2. And so I will be 0, I will be 1, I will be 2, and so on, all the way up to, but not including n minus 2. So it loops, like if n were 6, it loops for 4 times. Loops 4 times, 0 through 3. I would be 0 through 3. So that's what I want. I want it to loop n minus 2 times. Iterate n minus 2 times, that is. All right. So now I can calculate my new value. So I'll say new value equals, and I'm going to look at the sequence then, and I want to look at the last two numbers in the sequence and add them together. So pause the video if you want, but what has to go here to get the last number in the sequence? Think about it. And it's going to be sequence of -1 gives me the last value, and I'm going to add to that sequence of -2, which gives me the second to the last value, and then I add those two together, and that makes the new value, right? That calculates the new value. Now with new value, I'm going to do sequence dot append, and I'm going to append the new value to the list. I am not going to write this. This is not what you want here. Let me just show you sequence dot append new value. You don't want this because the append method, all methods work in place. They modify the variable in place, so you don't need to assign it to sequence there. So we're not going to do that. All right. So this should do it. This loops, calculates a new value by looking at the previous two, appends the new value, and then comes back up and does this n minus 2 times for a total of n values, because we have two already stored in there, two values already stored in there. So now when that loop is done, I want to return the sequence. Okay, so notice the indentation here for return. It's outside of the for loop, but it's still within the else block. So no matter which block of our if statement, we're returning something, right? All right, so now that should be good for my function. And then outside of my function, according to the directions, I'm going to call it, so my Fibonacci, and we're going to call it with 6, and then we're going to print the values. Actually, I'm not ready to do that yet. We're going to print the values, or we're going to print the items in the list, or the list itself, I guess. So we have to accept that output value from the function. So I can assign it to like variable s or for sequence or anything I like, but it should be descriptive. And then I'm going to print s, print the contents of s, and then just to distinguish it from future function calls, I'm actually going to just print a bunch of dashes here. You'll see why in a second, just to make it look a little bit nicer in the console. All right, so that's my first function call, and I'm going to copy that and then paste, and then according to the directions, I want to call it with 20 as the input. So I'll do the same thing, and then according to the directions, I'm going to call it with no input, and the default value, remember, is n equals 1, so it should just return the first number in the sequence, which is 1. All right, now the last thing that I probably want to do is I want to handle the case where the user inputs like a string or something that's not an integer. Even though we're not doing that in this case, right, 6, 20, and default, we still want to make our function more robust. Like if I were to give the range function something like spam, like a string, right, what's going to happen is that I'm going to get a type error because range wants an integer. And even if I gave it like something 4.1, a float, it wants an integer, and I get another type error. So I want to handle this exception. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to do all of this. Try, and this is inside the function. Try to do that. So I'm going to highlight. I want all of this to be in the try block. So I'm going to highlight all of that under try and tab. So that tabs everything over. So it's going to try to do that, and then I'm going to say except, and notice that the except is justified with the try, and except if I get a type error, then then I know that the user is not sending an integer, to my function. So I'm going to say print error. This function requires an int as input. Okay, and that's fine. That's enough. All right. So all this should be good to go. I'm going to Control S. It's giving me a warning there for some reason. Unindent does not match. It should. I think it's okay. Maybe I wasn't quite justified with the try. Yeah. Okay, so you need to make sure that these things line up perfectly. I was getting a little warning there on the accept line that I was off by one space for the try. So now everything matches. I'm going to clear everything, and I'm going to Control S and save this, and then I'm going to run it and see what happens. All right, so you can see the dashed lines are like separating each function call. That's the purpose. So the first time I make the function call, I say that I want 6 numbers. And so here are the first 6 numbers of the Fibonacci sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. So that matches the example. And then the next time I call it with 20. So here are the first 20 numbers of the Fibonacci sequence. And then the third time I don't give it an input at all. And so remember the default value is n equals 1. And in this case, I get the first value, which is n equals 1, inside a list. And we could try this thing even more, even though we weren't asked to do it. We could try inputting like spam or some string, and hopefully it would print error. This function requires an int as input. Now finally, and this is the last thing I want to say about this, if you're preparing this to turn into somebody, then your file is named appropriately. So my file here is example section 4-1.py, and it's in my desktop. So if I navigated to my desktop, you would see this file here, and that's the file that I want to submit. And to prepare for submission, I want to put the author. So I would put my name there, and then I would put the date last updated, right? And I would put the date there, and then I want some comments like, okay, here's a function, so you should describe the function right away at the very top. So my Fibonacci, Fibonacci, having a hard time with that one today. My Fibonacci returns the fib sequence. I'm just going to put fib sequence as a list. Okay, and you might want to say some more things like, hey, this is going to return the empty list, right? And then this will return the first value in the sequence, that is, and this will return the first 2 in the sequence. And then here's where the magic happens. This is calculate subsequent values, right, of the sequence. And this n-2 thing is a little weird, so we might say already calculated, or already defined, maybe, because we didn't really calculate anything. Already defined first 2 values, so we don't need to do n, we just need to do n-2. And then we might want to say here for the accept, in case user calls function without integer, int. And then we might say something like this outside in the main program: first function call, right? Second function call, and third function call. So now I have my program. I've tested it, it works. I've used descriptive variable names and function names. I've used white space nicely, right? Blocked off the code nicely using white space in between different blocks. And then I've commented everything very nicely. I've got my name, presumably, and the date up there, and I'll Control S, and I'm ready to submit my function. Thank you.